There are moments that redefine everything that follows them. Moments where the world, as it existed just seconds before, becomes something unrecognizable. On the morning of March 12, 2026, students at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, arrived at Constant Hall expecting nothing more than another lecture, another set of notes, another ordinary step in the rhythm of their academic lives. What they encountered instead was a crisis that would test the courage of everyone in that building and raise urgent questions that universities, law enforcement agencies, and policymakers across the country would spend months trying to answer. One educator lost their life that morning, others were injured, and a group of students made a decision under pressure that most people will never fully be able to comprehend. This is the story of what happened at Old Dominion University and the decade of history that led to it. Old Dominion University has been a cornerstone of Norfolk, Virginia for over a century. With more than 20,000 students, it is one of the most diverse and dynamic public universities on the East Coast, a place where military families and first-generation college students, engineers and artists, nurses and researchers all share the same campus. Norfolk itself is a city shaped by the sea, by the Navy, by generations of working families who built something here and passed it on. The ODU campus carries that energy. There's a sense of purpose on its grounds, a busy, forward-moving atmosphere that comes from a student body that largely commutes, that balances jobs and classes and families, that doesn't take the opportunity of education for granted. Constant Hall, one of the university's well-established academic buildings, had seen thousands of lectures within its walls. Professors and students had passed through its corridors in every season, through exams and celebrations and the quiet, daily work of learning. On the morning of March 12th, those corridors were full of exactly that, the ordinary business of a university day, backpacks and coffee cups, voices in the hallways, screens lighting up with lecture slides, the particular kind of focused energy that settles over a classroom just as a session is about to begin. No one in that building had any reason to believe this Wednesday would be different from any other. At some point during the morning, Mohammed Baylor Jallow entered a classroom inside Constant Hall. He was 36 years old, a resident of Virginia, and a former member of the Virginia Army National Guard. According to early reports from witnesses and investigators, before the situation escalated, Jallow asked whether the class was connected to ROTC, the Reserve Officers Training Corps program that trains students for military service. It was a question that seemed strange in the moment. Within seconds, it became clear that it was not a question born of curiosity. Jallow opened fire. One person was killed. An instructor, a person who had come to that classroom to teach, to guide, to contribute to the education of the students in their care. Two other individuals were injured in the attack. In the terrible, compressed seconds during which the shooting took place, the lives of everyone in that room were altered in ways that will take years to fully understand. The loss of the instructor at the center of this tragedy represents something that resonates far beyond one building on one campus. Teachers and professors accept a particular kind of trust when they stand at the front of a room. A responsibility not just to share knowledge, but to create an environment where students feel safe enough to learn, to question, to grow. That trust was catastrophically violated on March 12th, and the person who honored it until the very end deserves to be remembered not as a statistic in a tragedy, but as someone who showed up that morning to do meaningful work. In the immediate moments after the shooting began, the room became a landscape of confusion and fear. Students were processing something for which no amount of academic training fully prepares a person. The reality of a life-threatening emergency unfolding in what had been, seconds before, a completely safe space. Some students moved toward exits, others sought cover. The mental noise of a crisis, the disorientation, the disbelief, the struggle to accept what the senses are reporting, makes the first moments of any emergency among the most dangerous. The instinct to freeze, to wait for more information, to hope that what is happening is somehow not what it appears to be, is deeply human. And it is precisely the instinct that emergency response training tries to override. The students in that classroom had not necessarily signed up for the kind of split-second decision-making that March 12th demanded of them. They were there to learn. They were there for an education. And yet, in one of the most disorienting and frightening moments a person can experience, Several of them found something within themselves that most of us will never be called upon to locate. According to investigators and early accounts from those present, a group of students confronted Mohammed Baylor Jallow during the attack. They did not wait for law enforcement. They did not wait for the situation to resolve itself. In the midst of a dangerous and rapidly evolving emergency, they intervened. And their intervention brought the threat to an end before more people could be harmed. Law enforcement officials who responded to the scene and who have since analyzed the events of that morning have been clear in their assessment. The actions taken by those students almost certainly prevented additional casualties. They use the word courageous. It is not a word that law enforcement applies casually or without evidence. In this case, it was applied with full understanding of what those students had faced and what they had chosen to do in response. Jallow did not survive the encounter. The precise details of how the confrontation concluded, the sequence of events between the students' intervention and the arrival of police, remained part of the active investigation in the immediate aftermath. But the outcome was not in dispute. The threat had been stopped, and it had been stopped in significant part by people who had come to that building to attend a class. As law enforcement began the work of understanding what had happened and who was responsible, the identity of Mohammed Baylor Jallow brought the investigation into territory that went far beyond a single incident at a single university. Jallow had served in the Virginia Army National Guard, a background that suggested familiarity with weapons and tactical environments, but it was his history after his military service that immediately drew the attention of federal investigators. Because Mohammed Baylor Jallow was not unknown to law enforcement, he had, in fact, been the subject of a federal investigation a full decade before the events at Old Dominion University. That history would become the central question of the entire case, not just what Jallow had done on March 12, 2026, but how the decade that preceded it had unfolded, and what it meant for the systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of violence. In July of 2016, the FBI arrested Mohammed Baylor Jallow as part of an undercover investigation. Jallow was 26 years old at the time. Federal investigators had been monitoring him, gathering evidence of what they assessed to be a genuine and dangerous radicalization, not a casual flirtation with extremist ideology, but a serious alignment with the goals and methods of ISIS, the Islamic State. The investigation revealed that Jallow had taken concrete steps that went beyond the expression of extreme views. He had attempted to acquire a weapon. He had, according to investigators and court documents, discussed the possibility of carrying out an attack, and the model he reportedly had in mind was the 2009 shooting at Fort Hood, Texas, one of the most devastating acts of violence ever to occur on a United States military installation. The FBI's intervention prevented whatever Jallow may have been planning at that time. It was precisely the kind of outcome that the Bureau's Counterterrorism Division is designed to produce, identifying a threat before it becomes an attack, disrupting the trajectory toward violence before lives are lost. In October of 2016, Jallow pleaded guilty in federal court to attempting to provide material support to ISIS, a designated foreign terrorist organization. It was not an ambiguous charge, and it was not a case built on speculation. He had acknowledged his intent. He had entered a formal legal admission of his actions and his alignment with a terrorist group responsible for mass atrocities around the world. In 2017, a federal judge sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison, to be followed by a period of supervised release. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the charge. The judicial system had processed a case, reached a verdict, and imposed a consequence. Federal records indicate that Mohammed Baylor Jallow was no longer in federal custody as of December 2024. He had been released more than 2 years before the end of what a straight calculation of his 2017 sentence would have projected. The federal prison system contains mechanisms that can result in release before a full sentence is served. Sentence reductions for good behavior, adjustments based on time served before sentencing, and other provisions of federal law can all shorten the time an individual actually spends incarcerated. These provisions exist for legitimate reasons. They are part of a system that, at least in theory, tries to balance punishment with the recognition that people and circumstances change over time. But in the specific case of a man who had entered a guilty plea to terrorism-related charges, who had acknowledged attempting to support an organization that commits mass violence, who had discussed carrying out an attack himself, The question of what happened between December 2024 and March 12, 2026 became, in the aftermath of the ODU shooting, one of the most pressing questions in American law enforcement. 15 months. That is the gap between the record showing Jallo's release from federal custody and the morning he walked into Constant Hall. 15 months during which, presumably, he was subject to the terms of supervised release, regular check-ins with federal probation officers, restrictions on his movements and associations, ongoing monitoring designed to ensure that the conditions that had produced his radicalization were being addressed. What those 15 months actually looked like, whether the supervision had been rigorous, whether warning signs had been present and missed, whether Jallo had re-engaged with extremist networks or ideologies, became the central thread of the federal investigation that followed the shooting. Investigators were examining his digital communications, his financial records, his associations, his activities during the period of his supervised release. The answers would take time, but the questions were immediate, and they were urgent. Within hours of the shooting, the FBI announced that it was investigating the attack at Old Dominion University as a possible act of terrorism. The announcement was not made lightly. Terrorism investigations carry specific legal and evidentiary standards, and the Bureau's decision to frame the investigation in those terms reflected information that had emerged quickly from the scene. Among the factors driving that designation was a report from witnesses at the scene. According to those accounts during the attack, Jallo was heard shouting a phrase associated with extremist ideology, a verbal declaration that, taken together with his prior conviction and the targeting of individuals with a connection to military training, pointed investigators toward a conclusion about the nature and intent of the attack. The FBI was also examining whether Jallo had acted alone or whether he had been in contact with any networks or individuals connected to extremist activity during his time on supervised release. In terrorism investigations, the question of whether an attacker is a so-called lone actor or part of a broader network has significant implications for how law enforcement responds and what additional threats may exist. Federal agents worked alongside Norfolk police and Virginia state law enforcement in the immediate aftermath to secure the scene, interview witnesses, and begin the long process of reconstructing a complete picture of what had happened and why. The Department of Justice was briefed. Congressional offices were notified. The machinery of federal response, which has developed considerably since the early years of counterterrorism work following September 11, 2001, moved quickly and deliberately. Old Dominion University went into lockdown in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. The alert system, the text messages, the sirens, the notifications pushed to every registered device on the network, activated and spread the warning across a campus that had, minutes earlier, been operating in complete normalcy. Students who were in other buildings were told to stay where they were. Outdoor spaces were cleared. Police vehicles converged on Constant Hall from multiple directions. The perimeter was established. Students who had been inside the building during the shooting were guided out through secured corridors, some of them still processing what they had witnessed, some of them in shock, some of them in tears. Emergency medical personnel responded to treat those who had been injured. The injured individuals were transported to area hospitals for treatment of their wounds. Counselors and mental health professionals were mobilized by the university to begin providing support to students, faculty, and staff who had experienced or witnessed the attack. In the hours that followed, university leadership addressed the campus community. Norfolk's mayor and Virginia's governor issued statements. Law enforcement officials held a press conference to share what information they were able to make public at that stage of an active investigation. The language was careful, the facts limited, the acknowledgement of ongoing investigative work prominent. But the essential reality was conveyed. A shooting had occurred at Old Dominion University. A life had been lost, and federal authorities were treating the matter with the full weight of a potential act of terrorism. In the days that followed March 12, 2026, Old Dominion University became a place of dual realities, grief and gratitude existing side by side, impossible to separate. The grief was centered on the instructor who had been killed in Constant Hall. Colleagues shared memories of a person who had been dedicated to their students, who had shown up every day to do work they believed in. Students posted on social media about classes they had taken, conversations they remembered, the particular ways in which this educator had shaped how they thought about their field of study. A life in teaching is measured in hundreds of small moments of connection. in the students who remember a conversation years later, in the ideas that take root in a classroom and grow into something the teacher never gets to see. That life had been cut short on a Wednesday morning in March. The loss was real, and it was specific, and it deserved to be mourned in exactly those terms. The two individuals injured in the attack faced their own recoveries, physical healing that would take weeks, and the psychological recovery that follows an experience of sudden violence, which follows no predictable timeline and cannot be rushed or scheduled. Resources were made available. Support was offered. But the work of recovery from trauma is deeply personal, and it unfolds on its own terms. For the broader student body, for the thousands of ODU students who had not been in Constant Hall that morning, but who now moved through a campus permanently marked by what had happened there, the impact was more diffuse and no less real. The sense of safety that a university campus is supposed to provide had been disrupted. The abstract awareness that violence can happen anywhere had become, for this community, a concrete and personal reality. And yet, woven through all of that grief and disruption was something else. Something that universities don't usually get to report after a campus shooting. The story of what the students had done. The question of campus safety in the United States has been one of the most contested and emotionally charged policy debates of the past 2 decades. Since the late 1990s, universities and schools across the country have invested heavily in emergency preparedness. Active shooter protocols, lockdown procedures, threat assessment teams, anonymous reporting systems. Some of that investment has saved lives. Some of it has reshaped the culture of educational institutions in ways that carry their own psychological costs. The debate about what more could or should be done remains unresolved. The question of radicalization and supervised release is, in some ways, an even more difficult conversation. It intersects with criminal justice reform, with the capacity of the federal prison system to provide genuine rehabilitation programming, with the resources available to federal probation officers monitoring former terrorism offenders, and with the fundamental difficulty of predicting human behavior. There are no easy answers here, only hard trade-offs and the knowledge that whatever system is in place, it failed in the case of Mohammed Baylor Jallow. The FBI's counterterrorism work, which stopped Jallow in 2016, represents one of the genuine achievements of post-September 11th law enforcement. The Bureau has disrupted dozens of plots, prevented attacks that would have claimed lives, and done so through patient, evidence-based investigative work. That record is real. But the events of March 12, 2026 demonstrated that disrupting a threat and permanently neutralizing it are not the same thing, and that the period following a conviction and release may require as much attention and resource as the investigation that preceded it. What remains at the center of this story, what will remain there long after the investigations are concluded and the reports are filed and the policy debates have run their course, is the human reality of what happened in that classroom. An educator who showed up to teach is gone. Students who came to learn were forced to make decisions under impossible pressure, and several of those students chose, in the face of a life-threatening situation, to act in a way that protected the people around them. The courage required to do what those students did cannot be manufactured by a training seminar or a policy directive. It comes from something harder to quantify and impossible to legislate. The human instinct to protect, to stand alongside other people when standing requires real sacrifice. Law enforcement called them courageous. The word is correct, but it barely captures the weight of what that word means when applied to the specific reality of what they did. Old Dominion University will carry March 12, 2026 for a long time. The campus community will rebuild its sense of safety, gradually and imperfectly, as communities always do. The policy conversations that the attack has reopened will continue, about supervision of former terrorism offenders, about campus security, about the long and difficult work of addressing radicalization before it reaches the point of violence. And somewhere in Norfolk tonight, the family of an educator who did not come home is grieving a loss that no amount of policy improvement or systemic reform will ever undo. That loss is the weight at the center of everything. It is the weight that demands the hardest questions be asked and the most honest answers be pursued. The students who intervened that morning gave many of their classmates the chance to go home. They gave us a story that, in the midst of everything terrible about March 12, 2026, contains something genuinely worth holding on to. Evidence that ordinary people, in the most extraordinary and frightening circumstances, are capable of extraordinary things. That is not a comfortable ending, but it is a true one.